Thank you, Sam. Our last talk for this session is from Owen Fields, who comes to us from Pfizer, and he'll talk about training the regulatory scientists for medical product development.
Where did the instrument that advances the slides go? That was my suspicion as well. All right, so I took the liberty of changing the title of my talk from the agenda very slightly, and then I extended it for obvious reasons, as you'll see. All right, so by way of outline, I'm going to discuss several measures that my group and Pfizer have taken to develop new regulatory science talent. These are largely learn by doing roles. I'll talk about secondments, both informal and formal, an internship program we've had now for 3 years, as well as mentoring. I will relate each of these to similar or potential mechanisms that exist in the U.S. government. I should add a disclaimer that my U.S. government service was over 20 years ago now. And I will also, on each of these, provide practicality issues. So that is the practicality of attracting and retaining the right people. And at the end, I'm hopefully going to bridge these ideas to the future. It was asked to be incendiary. I'm not sure these are going to be incendiary ideas. I hope they are provocative, and I also hope that they're practical. And I'll talk about the concept of formal postdoctoral programs in regulatory science, as well as regional and even industry and FDA collaborations and internship programs for cross-training. All right, so what's the importance of the topic and this entire session? I think we all know that the most important element of our infrastructure is really the talent of our regulatory scientists. Innovations often come from both industry as well as government, so you need that talent in both the government and in industry. However, we have to recognize that regulatory science is typically an alternative career for basic and medical scientists. There's very substantial knowledge gaps, and others have talked about this, outside of a fairly narrow community, especially in the academic world. Too often, as I will illustrate, the move to regulatory science is a pure accident. And in my view, we need to develop a sort of high scientific medical talent pipeline mentality to, facilitate the flow of new talent, especially highly technically fluent talent into the area. So what was my personal experience, and that's partly why I have an interest in this area. I think it illustrates the randomness of the path that people take to regulatory science. I was near the end of my graduate education. I was considering something away from the bench. I don't even think the term alternative career even existed back then, but it certainly is used in academic settings now. I had absolutely no idea where to start. I happened to be at a conference, and I walked by a table that had an FDA banner on it. I actually walked by, and then I thought a little bit and turned around and walked back. And I made it through what is a hiring process I still don't understand and probably never will. But basically, I worked at FDA, and I was a molecular biologist by training at Berkeley, and I worked in food biotechnology at FDA. So that was useful, and frankly, it was probably the best blind luck I've ever had. My graduate advisor was, as I said here, not supportive. That's an understatement. He spent 5 minutes yelling at me in front of the entire lab. He later had a change of heart because his wife decided to pursue an alternative career. And he actually asked me to write a paper on the topic due to the lack of knowledge in most people's perspective, which I did. And in writing that paper, I analyzed the path of 6 of the most talented Pfizer colleagues I knew of, and every single one of them came to regulatory science through some element of blind luck. In some cases, 2 or 3 elements of blind luck. All right, so what are the measures that my group has used? Secondments have been very successful. These are essentially temporary or part-time work by scientists who are already at Pfizer in one of the science functions. The U.S. government cognate is clearly the detail system that the U.S. government has, which is quite active. In terms of examples, we have most often used a 1-day-a-week experience. The donor program or the donor department finds this much more palatable They find it's a good way for them to learn regulatory science, which helps them in their day jobs. We have 8 examples of that. We had one that was a full-time secondment. Again, just one example. So far, 3 of these individuals have been hired into the function, and typically we have them, assist a global regulatory lead or take on what I call bite-sized efforts or do regulatory research. In terms of practicality, we found that the 1 day a week is actually a lot more practical to the donor unit. In terms of the ability to attract them if they wanted them come to regulatory science, it's quite competitive, and I believe that the FDA pay would be competitive, with, for example, NIH or even EPA or other technical organizations in the government. But the big lesson there is really that the 1 day, unlike the US government details that I had experience with, sort of the 1 day a week arrangement actually works better. All right, mentoring is, as we all know, hiring qualified scientists into a role for which they're not at least initially qualified by direct experience, and then train them by doing. We all know that certainly at FDA and in most US government agencies that deal with science, this is the normal way of developing new staff. I put a number of examples here. You see that I have people that have been, we have people who have been out of their graduate research for quite a long time. The one that came the quickest was the one at the bottom. They got their PhD in molecular genetics from an obscure English college known as Oxford. They, like me, they decided they didn't want to work at the bench anymore, and they actually ended up roughly for a year at a consultancy. I can tell you all of these individuals are viewed as very highly talented and valuable within the company now. And in terms of practicality, industry salaries for PhD scientists are quite competitive, even at the entry level in regulatory affairs. You will notice that there are no MDs on the list, and that's because the salary history of MDs once they come to industry is often a bit too high for an entry level, so we may need to do something about that in the long term. Internships, this was mentioned in Scott's talk. I think we know what these are. There are some US cognates. The first year we had a single individual from a master's in biotechnology program that had a regulatory concentration. The second year we interviewed 5 candidates from the same program. The third year we interviewed roughly 25 applicants from the Johns Hopkins program. We engaged 3 of those, and so far 1 of those has been hired into a regular role. Practicality of this is extremely high. It's very, very good bang for the buck. I believe even at FDA the pay grades would be competitive with some of the other roles. And the lesson we learned here is that we greatly underrated the value of resume building. Somebody coming to a major company and get to work on multiple modalities, multiple therapy areas. So it was incredibly attractive. And the Johns Hopkins program, I didn't even know they had so many people in the program, but it appeared as if every single person applied to our program. All right, so what about the future? Well, we're going to continue the above, plus I've thought of some other ideas. And really the long-term goal is to make the path to this alternative career less of an accident. So I've considered the concept of regulatory science postdoctoral programs. If regulatory science is indeed a distinct area of science now, why shouldn't we have postdoctoral programs the way every other distinct area of science does? There are some US government cognates, some of the FDA fellowships. I think the pay rates are generally competitive. Another idea is intern rotations across different employers and units. I think that would actually be more enriching for the intern in some ways than a stint at a single employer. This would probably be most practical at areas with multiple employers or units. Philadelphia is an obvious candidate, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the San Francisco Bay Area, and of course FDA centers could also, and likely do, have intern rotation programs. Another concept would be FDA industry rotations. That could raise some practicality issues, conflict of interest, especially the transition from US government to industry, and confidentiality and the need for cooperation among competitive entities. Right, and with that, I will stop and thank you, and then we will progress to the panel.